Number 1. So this story happened about 10 years ago when I was around 10 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was young and in elementary school, so let's go with around 10. I lived 3 houses down from my second cousin and best friend at the time, Anna, who was just 1 year younger than me. It happened during summer break from school. We lived in a very safe neighbourhood and used to play out on the street every day, all day, just going to our houses to eat. On that day I absolutely remember, we were rollerblading up and down our street when we saw a man pacing around and watching us. He was tall, skinny, pale, and had black greasy hair and wore a sweater, midday on a hot summer day. For some reason, being young, naive and stupid, we thought what he was doing was funny, so we kept rollerblading by him. Probably on the second time we passed him, he started touching himself down there watching us pass by. At that point we were creeped out, but we weren't sure if that really just happened, so we passed him again. And he had his thing completely out, stroking, and he dropped his pants to the ground right in front of us, still stroking and smiling. Mind you, this was in the middle of the day, probably early afternoon on a nice summer day. We got so scared. I remember feeling so violated and terrified. We hurried to my house. It was closer, even though hers was only 3 more houses down. We told my parents what had happened, and they called the police. I remember it took them a very long time to come, and of course the man was gone by the time they did. Me and Anna were asked some questions by the police. A report was made. They even sent a helicopter to look for the man, but they never found him. Thankfully, we never saw him again. Number 2. When I was about 7 years old in 2007, I was very close to being abducted. I remember it vividly, and I am still terrified of what happened. I live in a 2-story house in a safe neighbourhood. My mother and I were the only ones home at the time. My mother was taking a bath upstairs while I watched Nickelodeon downstairs alone in the living room. The way my house is set up is that anyone can see into the living room through the front door, even if the door is shut. I remember hearing a knock on the door, and I couldn't ignore it since whoever it was at the door could see me and knew someone was home. My mum usually would hide in the kitchen until the person knocking went away, and it was too late for me to run into the kitchen, since he could see me. I remember feeling guilty since my mum has always warned me never to open the door to strangers. I got the key and unlocked the door. A man in his early 30s or late 20s wearing work clothes and a green tie was at the door. He asked me if I knew where my neighbour was and that he needed to see him. I also noticed that the guy was looking around inside of my house while he waited for me to answer. I asked him which neighbour he was talking about, and then he said that he was older and lived somewhere near here. He didn't give me a name and he was as vague as possible. I felt bad because I didn't know who he was talking about, since I live in a neighbourhood with primarily older couples. I told him that I couldn't help him, but then he insisted that I help him search the neighbourhood for my neighbour. I declined and the guy kept asking me. I told him no once more. Then the guy grabbed my arm and started to pull me out of my house. I grabbed the door frame and called for my mum. The man let go of my arm and started to casually walk back to his car. I'm pretty sure it was a beige Civic, but I'm not too sure. What scares me the most is that he didn't bolt and speed off. He was just too calm. I stood there and watched him drive away as if nothing bad had happened. Number 3. When I was in 6th grade, which would put me around 10 years old, my school had us do those scammy door-to-door candy sales. I say scammy because the prizes were so far from possibly attaining, but they sure lit the fire under our asses in an attempt to sell enough to get a dope scooter. After taking all the usual routes of having my parents hawk overpriced chocolate to their co-workers, and shaking down friends and family, I took to the streets. It was the 90s, so I knew the people in my neighbourhood pretty well, although it had a huge amount of drug activity and a sketchy bar. But I was so motivated, I ended up about 6 blocks down, way beyond where I was allowed to go alone. I remember so vividly this house. It was dingy with cheap blue panels. I knocked and a woman answered the door. I recited my lines. She drapes a hand on my shoulder, leading me into the entrance while calling up, "There's a little girl here." She wants us to buy some chocolate. A man responded from upstairs. She asked me questions like where I went to school, how old I was, where I lived, and if my parents knew where I was. Questions that were making me increasingly uncomfortable. I heard a door open upstairs, and I looked to the stairway to see a man descending holding a fucking cleaver. At peace with losing the sale over my life, I opted to run home as fast as I could. I never did that shit again.